This is Hannibal from the HannibalTV.com, and this is the very first of a multi-series group of podcasts I'm going to do, because I'm posting them on my iTunes Great North Wrestling podcast page, but I'm also going to post them on my YouTube.com, the Hannibal TV page, Canada's most popular pro wrestling YouTube channel from a company based in Canada, which I, of course, run. And these are going to be about my various WWE experiences. I was signed by the WWE in 2009. However, that contract was ultimately rescinded. However, I had a lot of WWE experiences leading up to that contract, so I'm going to go through them all time by time for you. There was a lot of them. Some of them are more exciting than others, but I'm sure there's some details in there that a lot of you might find interesting. The first WWE experiences I ever had were the Raw and Smackdown tapings in Calgary and Kelowna, April 19th and 20th, 2004. That's Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and Kelowna, British Columbia, Canada. I was about 20 or 21 years old at the time. I'd been wrestling since I was 17, the Calgary area, the Montreal area. At this point, I was back in Calgary wrestling for Stampede Wrestling, but Bruce Hart, who was running Stampede Wrestling, did not necessarily have the best relationship with WWE at the time. So the person that got me the WWE job, initially it was only supposed to be the one night, the Raw in Calgary, but they ended up inviting me to Kelowna the next night, which was a 7-hour drive away, but that didn't bother me, was Les Thornton, who is probably best known for being a multiple-time NWA Junior Heavyweight Champion. He was a good friend of Dynamite Kid. He was actually in the match where Mick Foley had his jaw broken by Dynamite Kid in WWE, and he was in charge of training some WWE wrestlers for a while. They were sending them up to Calgary to train with Les, I think in the late 80s-ish. And he's a really nice guy. He passed away last year. Didn't have a funeral. The only thing he requested was that people make a donation to the Calgary Humane Society. So really good guy and a real shooter. He was the one that was actually wrestling Dory Funk Sr. when Dory Funk subsequently had his heart attack and died. So really tough guy. He had called, I think it was Tom Pritchard at the time, was running WWE Developmental, and they just invited me right away. And it was only a couple days before the event, so I didn't even really have much time to prepare. But I was excited. It was going to be an amazing opportunity for me. The other wrestlers getting extra jobs that day it was a guy named Wavell Star, who spent some time in Ohio Valley Wrestling. He's from Saskatchewan, but he also wrestled for the Stampede Wrestling reboot for a while. Really good wrestler, in my opinion. Ruffy Silverstein, he's from Toronto. He'd done a bunch of extra jobs. For a while, he also wrestled for the Stampede Wrestling reboot, but I didn't know him as well as Wavell. Bobby Roode was being used as an extra on these events. And Harry and Ted were also backstage. I can't recall if anyone else was. I do remember that there was a big hoopla, because I guess Harry was originally going to be booked against Chuck Palumbo on the Sunday Night Heat show, from what the rumor and innuendo was, and he didn't show up when all the extras were supposed to show up, which I think was around noon. So they thought that he just didn't want a job to Chuck Palumbo. That was the rumor going around, but the truth was he was still in school. He didn't get to the building till his school finished. He was still in high school at that time. So that was the root of the matter there. I don't believe Harry and Ted had a match on that show, from what I recall. I believe it was Wavell Star, Bobby Roode, Ruffy could have had a match, but that was a while ago. I haven't thought of it much, so I don't remember who exactly had matches. I didn't have a match. what I did that day, I remember I was in the ring with Batista, and Arn Anderson was the agent, and Tyson Tomko, and Batista and Tomko were still fairly green at this point. Tomko was actually debuting that night in Calgary, so Anderson was having them basically do various moves to us as we were the extras. I think I was taking a lot of it because I was one of the bigger extras. I was the biggest, I believe. So I did technically wrestle with Batista that day. I remember that he was not the most talkative, but nice. He was very nice. They all were nice. Tomko was nice. Edge was the first wrestler I met back there. He was very nice. I only remember positive experiences from that day. All it was basically was doing that bit in the ring for me with Batista and Tomko, who practiced this kick over and over and over again. And I remember thinking to myself, they're really putting a lot of pressure on him for this kick, which he was hitting when he was practicing it on us. But when he actually debuted that night as Christian's protege, he fell when he did the kick. And I don't know if his career ever recovered from that. His stint in WWE, I believe, could have been better. I do remember that Ric Flair was on that card, and I remember when he walked into the dressing room. At that show, the extras were in the same dressing room as the WWE wrestlers. So I remember when he walked into the dressing room, he actually did his woo, and he had his diamond rings on, a very fancy suit, and you could feel like the energy of the dressing room change when Flair walked into the dressing room. So I thought that was pretty cool. The extent of my conversation that day was shaking his hand, and he was very nice. Eric Bischoff was also being used that day, and I had remembered he was part of the Matt Rats show that I was part of just a few years earlier in 2001, before he went back to WWE, where he had given us all a speech that Matt Rats was going to be the next big thing in wrestling. And I remember when I shook Eric Bischoff's hand, he shook my hand, and I said, I brought up something like I was in Matt Rats or something, and he just kind of kept walking as if like that was not something that he wanted to go into. I was still really young at that time, so I thought he may have talked to me a bit about it or something, but he kind of just kept walking after I said that. I remember Chris Jericho was back there being very friendly with Ted and Harry. My only extent of conversation with him was shaking his hand at that time, but I remember that he was very cool with those guys. Benoit was back there too. Benoit would talk to me more in subsequent tryouts. He didn't talk to me much that day other than shaking my hand, and that was about it that stood out. The only other thing that stood out was at the end of the night, I remember Edge and Ric Flair giving each other hell in a joking manner about the chops that they had given each other in the match. I think they were in some type of tag team match against each other, and I remember we got the pay for that night. It was $400, which I'm not even sure if I made $400 in a week in those days with the various jobs that I had in the security industry. And they asked me if I would mind going to Kelowna the next night, which was 7 hours away. And couldn't have said yes any faster. I mean, to get $400 in a night for having as much fun as I had that night was a dream come true to me. I think I went home to get a change of clothes and then drove directly to Kelowna. The next day, I remember it was a different crew at that time, Raw and Smackdown. I remember Rene Dupree was one of the first people I saw backstage who had been in Matt Rats. And at that time, he was getting the push to wrestle John Cena. And Rene was really friendly. He was no different to me then than he is to me today. He was really nice, down to earth. I actually did meet John Cena there. I remember I was in a different dressing room than him, but at one point during the day, I went to use the bathroom, and I thought it was basically a bathroom door, but inside this dressing room was Bubba Ray Dudley and John Cena. I remember John Cena was kind of pacing back and forth, reading a script, and Bubba was sitting down or something. I just remember asking them if they mind if I used their washroom. They didn't have an issue with it. That stood out to me. I think I did meet Cena a couple other times, but that was actually the time that stood out the most to me about meeting Cena, just because I was kind of nervous that I had walked into their dressing room, even though he wasn't as big a star back then. I didn't want to get any heat. One thing that may have got me heat that day, looking back, I may have been a bit naive to say this, but I used to bounce with a guy in Ottawa around 2002 during the time I was training with Jacques Rougeau, and he was a football player. He somehow knew Stephanie from college. I think he either played at the college she went to, which I think was somewhere in Boston, or somehow they knew each other from their college days, and they were kind of like fuck buddies, I guess you could call them. They'd had sex numerous times, and she'd even come to visit him in Ottawa, I guess, and hung out. And he still lived with his parents at that time, even though he was Stephanie's age, so he was a good at least 10 or more years older than me. He was a tough guy, really cool guy, by the way. As I said, I think his name was Steve Campagna. It's been a long time since I knew him, but he told me that he remained in contact with Stephanie, and every time WWE came to Ottawa, she always sent him free tickets. They had stopped their sexual relationship by then, but he'd always told me, if you ever meet Stephanie, drop my name to her. So I dropped his name to her. I said I'd bounced with him, and I just remember it was really awkward. She gave me a look, and she definitely knew him. But like, it was just like an awkward look, and like, how did you know this information? It wasn't like, oh yes, tell him I said hi next time you see him. So that was a little awkward. I did meet Vince McMahon that day. I did shake his hand. That wasn't my most memorable interaction with him, but that was my only interaction with him that day. They did nothing with us that day in the ring. I seem to recall the main thing going on in the ring that day before the show was the practicing of the Café de Rene that I think John Cena was going to possibly be a guest on that day. And there was a Fifi, and it was a lot of just going over that, and they had the whole setup in the ring, so there wasn't really an opportunity for us to wrestle anyone or wrestle each other or anything like that in front of the agents. I remember it was not a good crowd that night. They did not have a big crowd. I don't think they ever did another taping in Kelowna after that, come to think of it, and I don't even know if they go to Kelowna anymore, but it was a very small crowd. The night before in Calgary was a much better crowd. Paul London and Brian Kendrick were very nice. They made us all feel welcome back there. I do not remember who had matches, but I believe it may have been Bobby Roode that had a match, if anyone had a match. I don't have any recollection of having any contact with John Laurinaitis at either of these tapings. I did have contact with him, I think, at almost every other extra job I had. Johnny Ace, or John Laurinaitis, was in charge of hiring talent at that time. The other thing I forgot to mention was Harry and Ted did not go to the Kelowna show. I don't know if they were actually paid for being at the Raw, or they just showed up because they were Hearts and the Hearts are expected to show up, but they were definitely on WWE's radar. You could tell that the office was very interested in them at the Raw taping. So very positive experiences this first time backstage. It was motivation for me to continue training. The next time I was used as an extra, which I will get into in the next episode of this blog about my WWE experiences, I actually had the opportunity to amateur wrestle Shelton Benjamin one night, and then the next night wrestle and do drills with The Undertaker. So the next one is going to be a pretty interesting one. So stay tuned for that. I hope you enjoyed this one. Lots of information in there. Hopefully some of it you find entertaining.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Support us on patreon.com for $1.99 a month to watch our full shoot interviews ad-free and help our channel grow. Follow us on Twitter at the Hannibal TV for instant updates.